Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Brian and Michelle had lived in Boulder, Colorado, for 12 years, maintaining a relationship many would describe as stable, mature, and full of quiet gestures of partnership. He was a civil engineer, dedicated, methodical, the kind of person who made lists even for short trips. He worked at an urban infrastructure company and had held a leadership position for years, demanding much but also bringing him pride. Michelle, on the other hand, didn't work outside the home. She managed the household, organized their daily lives, and handled countless tasks most men never notice but that kept everything running smoothly. The two had built a solid routine with clear schedules, simple dinners during the week, and weekends spent walking through the park or watching movies on the couch. They didn't have children, but they made up for it with constant presence in each other's lives. Though passion had mellowed over time, there was tenderness, care, and that deep sense of being able to trust one another completely. That winter, Brian decided to try something different. After years without a trip just for the two of them, he thought it would be good to break the cycle of routine. He suggested a 4-day getaway to a mountain town in Utah, known for snowy trails and cozy wooden cabins. Michelle agreed right away. She liked the idea of stepping out of their routine, experiencing something new with her husband, and also appreciated the peaceful scenery the place promised. They packed their bags, sorted out warm clothes, reserved a small house near the trails, and set off by car, enjoying the drive as part of the experience. The journey was filled with light conversation, old songs, and coffee bought at roadside stops. The first 2 days went well. They took easy walks, snapped photos in the snow, dined at small local restaurants, and even tackled a moderate hike using snowshoes. It was during one of those hikes that everything changed. Michelle slipped while stepping onto a smoother patch covered in fine snow. The fall wasn't violent, but the angle at which she landed caused her body to absorb the impact in an unusual way. She immediately complained of back pain, and Brian helped her stand. They assumed it was something minor, maybe a sprain or muscle strain. Still, they decided to return to the cabin. The next day, they visited a local clinic. After a physical exam and some quick movement tests, the doctor diagnosed significant muscle swelling near the lower back, pressing on areas that were limiting mobility. It wasn't serious, but it was restrictive. She'd struggle to walk, sit, or move around without pain for several weeks. Treatment would involve rest, pain medication, and regular physical therapy sessions. They returned to Boulder a day earlier than planned. Brian quickly arranged everything, adjusted schedules, spoke with local doctors, and found a clinic that offered home visits. He wanted to make sure Michelle had all the support she needed without having to leave the house. On the third day after returning, a physical therapist came to the home. His name was Troy Becker, a 32-year-old man with a calm posture and professional appearance. He arrived on time, carrying a discreet suitcase and wearing the clinic's uniform with the company name embroidered on it. Michelle greeted him on the living room sofa, wrapped in a blanket, looking tired. Troy was polite, asked standard questions, reviewed the medical report, and made a few observations about the treatment plan. Brian, who was at home for this first session, followed everything closely and even asked a few questions about recovery timelines. The first sessions were strictly technical. Troy positioned cushions, explained exercises patiently, and demonstrated confidence in what he did. Michelle, still in pain, followed instructions with effort but without complaint. Brian tried to be present at the start of each session when possible, but his job called him early and kept him away until late afternoon. Troy maintained a consistently professional demeanor, even when he had to help Michelle get into or out of positions requiring close physical contact. Conversations in the early meeting stayed limited to medical topics, posture adjustments, and brief instructions on how to avoid worsening her condition. Michelle, still adjusting to the frustration of physical limitation, spoke little and focused solely on the treatment. But over time, the sessions would become more than just technical. It was still early for anything else, but something, though barely noticeable, was beginning to shift between the clinical touch and the casual glance. As days passed, physical therapy became a steady part of Michelle's routine. Brian left early for work, and shortly afterward, Troy arrived with his discreet case, tools, and the same technical instructions that marked the start of treatment. At first, everything felt functional, almost mechanical. Michelle still experienced pain and needed help shifting positions, realigning tense muscles, and stretching the sensitive area. But as her body gradually adapted to the exercises, the relationship between her and the therapist began to change subtly. Troy started arriving with light comments about the weather, traffic, or something he'd seen on the way. Michelle responded politely, and slowly, her brief replies gave way to fuller conversations. They talked about TV shows, favorite foods, childhood stories. When he applied stretches, he often shared experiences from working with other patients or places where he'd worked. Michelle found herself distracted by listening, relieved not to focus on pain or the boredom of sitting on the couch for hours. Troy spoke calmly, looked into her eyes frequently, and knew how to listen without seeming rushed. Michelle, isolated and frustrated by her physical limitations, began to realize she was starting to look forward to the sessions with a new kind of anticipation. The fact that Brian was always out of the house during the day created an atmosphere ripe for change. There was no obvious malice at first, but the space, once strictly professional, began to take on subtle nuances. Michelle started taking extra care before sessions, brushing her hair better, choosing blouses that highlighted her shoulders, lightly spraying perfume on her neck. These weren't conscious decisions, but small rituals emerging from a silent need to feel desired, even if she wouldn't admit it. Troy noticed the shift and responded with gentle compliments. He'd comment that she looked healthy, that her recovery progress was excellent, that other patients didn't show the same dedication. Each of these remarks, though disguised as professional encouragement, cut through Michelle like a reminder of something she hadn't heard in a long time at home. The quiet house, Brian's prolonged absence, and the routine restricted to medications and exercises turned Michelle's mind into fertile ground for confusing emotional interpretations. Troy's touch, though clinical, was consistent. He supported her gently, touched the area near her waist with care, kept his hands firm and respectful, but not cold. There was closeness. There was presence. And for someone who spent her days sitting, staring at the clock, waiting for pain to ease and time to pass, that presence began to fill empty spaces. On a Friday morning, after another stretching session, Michelle laughed at a silly comment Troy made about a video he'd seen. It was a long, spontaneous laugh that broke the stiffness she'd carried for weeks. Troy smiled too, and in that moment, their eyes met for longer than usual. Michelle looked away, but he didn't. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged with something that no longer fit within the category of patient and professional. When Troy said goodbye, he placed his hand on her shoulder a little longer than necessary. Michelle didn't pull back. In the following days, gestures like that repeated. There was no immediate kiss, no dramatic confession. Instead, it built slowly through small touches, lingering glances, and intentional silences. Until, during a longer session, Michelle looked up at him mid-breath, and Troy simply leaned in. The kiss happened naturally, almost inevitably. Michelle didn't resist, didn't hesitate, didn't think. By the time she realized it, her hands were already on his face, as if trying to confirm that this was really happening. The affair had no plan, but it wasn't an accident either. In the days that followed, kisses repeated. Troy arrived with more confidence, and she welcomed him with growing expectation. Touches during exercises grew more intimate, glances longer. Michelle knew what was happening crossed every ethical and marital boundary. But inside her, guilt seemed drowned out by adrenaline, the desire to feel alive, and the selfish pleasure of allowing herself something in a moment when she felt fragile, neglected, and above all, forgotten. She didn't think about consequences. She didn't plan to keep it going or end it. She just lived each day as if this secret could coexist with the rest of her life. It was a comfortable illusion, and she let herself drift into it with eyes wide open. On that Tuesday, everything seemed to unfold as usual. Brian had left early, left breakfast ready as he sometimes did, and mentioned he'd have an important meeting later in the afternoon. Michelle responded with a light smile, masking the unease that had become part of her routine since Troy had become more than just a professional in her life. She knew this day would bring another session, and as in recent times, it wasn't just about exercises and stretches. It was a moment thick with anticipation, tension, and above all, transgression. But Brian's day didn't go as planned. Around 3 in the afternoon, an electrical outage at the construction site halted all activity, and the lead engineer decided to send the team home early. Brian seized the unexpected break to stop by the grocery store, buy some fruit, and think about preparing something different for dinner. He didn't say he'd be coming back. He figured it would be a surprise. He drove home with a calm mind, listening to an old playlist and feeling that, after weeks of exhaustion, he finally had a night of rest ahead. When he parked in front of the house, he noticed the living room curtain was only partially closed, a common thing during the day. He grabbed the bags, crossed the garage, and unlocked the door with his usual key. As soon as he stepped inside, he sensed something odd. A heavy silence, as if the air had grown denser. He dropped the bags on the kitchen counter, took a few steps toward the living room, and turned the hallway corner, then froze. Before him, Michelle and Troy were on the sofa, side by side, locked in a passionate kiss full of intimacy, the kind of kiss that leaves no room for misunderstanding. Troy's hand rested on her waist. Michelle's eyes were closed. Brian stopped breathing. It was as if time had vanished. For a few seconds, he felt nothing. Then, suddenly, he felt everything. His stomach churned, his heart raced, his arms tingled. The image before him felt like part of a nightmare, but the sounds, smells, and details confirmed it was real. He dropped something he still held in his hand, probably the car keys, and the noise on the floor snapped the two out of their trance. Michelle looked at him as if she'd seen a ghost. Troy jumped back, eyes wide, body trying to find a position that might hide what had happened. But there was nothing left to conceal. Brian took 2 steps forward, breathing heavily, face tense, eyes fixed on both of them. Michelle tried to stand, but back pain prevented quick movement. Troy moved away from the sofa, raising his hands automatically, as if that gesture could soften the blow of betrayal. The initial silence was broken by Brian's firm voice. He asked what exactly was happening, even though the answer was written clearly before him. Michelle, voice trembling, tried to say it wasn't what it looked like. Troy remained silent, stepping back as if wishing to disappear. Brian, stunned, insisted. He wanted to hear it from her own mouth. Michelle began speaking, overwhelmed by her own anxiety. She said it meant nothing, that it was a mistake, that it had started innocently, that she'd been vulnerable, lonely, and didn't know how it had gotten so far. Brian interrupted her, his voice already filled with a pain that barely fit inside him. He asked how many times, whether it had happened in his home, whether she had any respect for everything they'd built together. Michelle cried, begged forgiveness, said she still loved him, that her feelings for him hadn't changed. But Brian's expression said everything. There was no room for belief anymore. No trust where there had once been complicity. He looked at Troy and said clearly that he should leave the house immediately. Troy tried to speak, to offer an explanation, a defense, but Brian raised his hand firmly and repeated it. He said Troy wasn't just fired, he would be reported to the professional board for unethical conduct. Troy hesitated for a moment, then picked up the backpack he'd left beside the sofa and left in silence, without looking back. Michelle tried to approach, still seated, eyes full of tears, saying they could talk, that they could overcome this, that it was all confusion. Brian didn't respond right away. He just stared at his wife as if searching inside her for any trace of the woman he once knew. But what he saw was only a shadow of everything they'd built together. He said only that she had destroyed something that could never be rebuilt. Then he turned, picked up the car keys still lying on the floor, and went to the bedroom. At that moment, he didn't know what would come next, but he already knew what had ended. The next morning after the confrontation, the house was filled with a thick silence, the kind that carries everything unsaid, everything that could never be repaired. Michelle sat for hours on the sofa, hands intertwined in her lap, gaze fixed on some undefined spot on the living room wall. Brian stayed locked in the guest room, not coming out even for breakfast. The only movement was the sound of water running in the bathroom and the occasional tapping of laptop keys for a few minutes. When they finally crossed paths, he simply announced without looking up that she should pack her things. He said there was no more space for both of them in the house. That what she had done was irreversible. The words were spoken calmly, but the tone carried a sharp coldness. Michelle didn't argue. She cried quietly, gathered a few clothes into a suitcase, took documents, medicine, and the tools she still used during recovery sessions. Then she called her sister, who lived just a few neighborhoods away, and briefly explained the situation. Her sister didn't ask questions. She just said Michelle could come whenever she wanted. By the end of the afternoon, Michelle left carrying her suitcase with difficulty, feeling her back still sensitive, her body exhausted, and a sadness so heavy it couldn't be described. The home that had once been her sanctuary was now hostile territory. And the husband who once prepared her meals no longer looked her in the eyes. Meanwhile, Brian spent that night on autopilot. He didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't break anything. What he felt wasn't explosive anger, but a silent kind of devastation. In the following days, he continued going to work, but something inside him had changed. Colleagues noticed his distant gaze, longer silences, a heavier expression. One longtime friend suggested he see a therapist. Brian resisted at first, like many men do, believing he could handle it alone. But after an entire weekend without proper sleep, he realized he needed help. He scheduled a session with a psychologist recommended by a colleague, and during their first conversation, he broke down. For the first time since the incident, he cried uncontrollably, as if emptying months of frustration, guilt, disbelief, and accumulated pain. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Troy received formal notification from the Physical Therapy Board. Brian's complaint had been accepted, unethical conduct with a patient during a home visit. The process, though swift, was firm. Troy's professional license was suspended initially, and after review by the disciplinary committee, it was officially revoked. He could no longer practice in any state. The clinic where he worked as a contractor terminated the contract immediately, and his name began circulating among professionals as a warning sign. Troy, who had built a reputation as a reliable professional, now faced public ruin of his career. He avoided responding to messages, deleted social media accounts, and within a short time, disappeared from the scene. Even with shame and the weight of guilt, Michelle knew she still needed to take care of her body. The back pain still limited her movement, and after a few weeks living with her sister, she decided to seek another physical therapist, this time a woman recommended by a family acquaintance. The new treatment progressed slowly, free of emotional involvement, just technique. The new therapist was serious, direct, and Michelle, embarrassed, avoided any conversation not related to treatment. After several more weeks of regular sessions, results began to appear. Pain decreased, mobility returned gradually, and by early spring, she could walk normally, without support or obvious limitations. Physically, she was healed. Emotionally, she still carried the wreckage of everything she had lost. Brian, on the other hand, continued steadily with therapy. With each session, he rebuilt a little of his own identity, reflected on the signs he had ignored, on how he had given himself in the relationship, and on the conflicting feelings that still surfaced when he thought of Michelle. Over time, he understood that her betrayal didn't erase who he was. And staying whole in the face of it was, in itself, a form of dignity. He started accepting invitations from friends again, resumed the habit of eating out, and even scheduled a small weekend trip to visit his mother in Denver. Work remained demanding, but now he didn't use it to escape his emotions. He used it as support to move forward. And even if his smile was still restrained, there was something different in his eyes, a spark of renewal. Of rebuilding. Of someone who, despite being wounded, chose not to lose themselves. The months that followed were hard on Michelle. Once her physical recovery was complete, she faced another reality, the absence of any income source. Since she had never worked outside the marriage and depended entirely on Brian, she had to navigate a world she didn't know. Living in her sister's home, she encountered bills, schedules, and the necessity of sustaining herself for the first time. At first, her sister covered expenses, but it didn't take long for Michelle to feel the discomfort of relying on someone else again. So she decided to start moving forward. With basic training in visual arts from a course she never finished, Michelle began offering small services. She made party favor kits for children's events, designed personalized invitations, and organized school supplies for busy mothers. Gradually, she earned some money and, in parallel, started giving tutoring lessons to neighborhood kids, especially on weekends. It wasn't much, but it allowed her to contribute something in her sister's home and, above all, regain a sense of value. Even so, the shadow of her mistake followed her silently. Every time she opened social media and saw friends who knew Brian, she felt the weight of judgment, even without words. She knew she had crossed a line, and certain consequences don't fade with time. Troy, meanwhile, disappeared for a while. After his license was revoked, he moved to a smaller, distant town where he began delivering food via app. The car he used for home visits became his work tool. He shared a modest apartment with another young man he met online and lived on weekly payments, with no guarantees, no stability. He tried exploring other fields, but without solid qualifications and with a name already linked to a professional scandal, doors remained shut everywhere. Sometimes, he took on small jobs on construction sites, carried boxes, helped with moves. He avoided talking about the past and never contacted Michelle again. What they had lived through now felt distant, almost absurd, as if it had happened to someone else. But the cost of it was real. And it was still being paid. Meanwhile, Brian continued on his path with greater steadiness. Therapy sessions continued, though less frequently. The pain was no longer sharp, it was just a scar that occasionally ached, but no longer defined his days. He regained the habit of having lunch with co-workers, returned to Saturday gatherings with friends, and rekindled his love for cooking at home, something he had abandoned during the marriage. His house, now quiet and more spacious, was slowly reorganized. He rearranged furniture, removed items tied to the past, and kept only what spoke to his present. There was no rush to start anything new. Brian didn't date anyone, didn't create profiles on dating apps, nor did he feel the need to fill the emptiness with another presence. He felt the most important process was already underway, reconnecting with himself. Occasionally, he remembered Michelle. But now those memories didn't come with anger. They were like memories of a time that had already ended. He didn't wish her harm, but he also didn't want to go back. Respect for himself had become the foundation of this new chapter. Michelle, on the other hand, remained in her sister's home indefinitely. She tried to expand her side gigs, took free online courses, and sold cakes by special order on holidays. Her routine was simple, solitary, full of small silences only she understood. She never reached out to Brian again, nor tried to explain herself once more. She knew she'd done all she could, and much of what she'd lost could never be recovered. The betrayal, which had begun as a quiet escape disguised as loneliness, revealed its true cost over time. It didn't just destroy a marriage, it ruined careers, broke bonds, and left invisible scars that each person would carry forever. There was no romantic restart, no emotional reconciliation. Only the natural progression of life, with its pains, lessons, and transformations. Because some falls aren't meant to return to the starting point, but to remind us that after impact, the only path forward is to keep going, even if we stumble at first. And that's exactly what each of them did. In their own way, at their own pace, guided by the rhythm of their hearts. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.